We are delighted to be closing out our 24th year of bringing you wonderful, remarkable speakers, two of whom we now add to our roster of wonderful speakers. Um, as you know, we are nonpartisan. The views that are presented are those of our speakers. And joining me are our other members of our team, Naomi Marrow, Carolyn Resnick, Tyler Beebe, and Amy Friedman is not with us, but she is, as you know, a very active member. Um, so in Joan, she somewhat took my speech out because I also wanted to say how important she has been to this program. What a pleasure it has been to working with her. I think she is almost like one of our founding members because she's been with the program from its very inception. So it's hard to say that this program, but it certainly would not be going on without Joan. And she has just made everything so easy. She's been our facilitator, our liaison, tech support, publicity, connector, and above all, a real cheerleader for us. So I think she didn't mention, but we should tell you an example of this very last time that she is with us, um, that she in fact was in an accident, not of her cause, but as she was coming to the library. And so for about an hour before this program, we were all in a panic as to how we were going to go live, whatever. And Joan said, "Don't worry, I'm going to take care of it. Everything will work out." And as you can see, we're here. But I want to tell you that certainly for Joan, she was calm, a little ruffled, but certainly basically calm. And then the library was there also to back her up if anything else um, happened and she couldn't get to us online to go live. So the priority was getting the program on live, even though Joan, I think otherwise probably would have liked to have gone home and had a good brandy to calm down. But anyway, we thank Joan. We will miss you. Joan, we have a gift for you that we will give you after the program. You have been really a mainstay to us, and we're really sorry to see you um, leave, though we are happy for you in retirement, that you get to do other things that I know you are so active that you will be continuing to do. So yesterday, as I think all of us know, we had a snow, and it was very frigid. And it's probably good entry to sort of what we're going to be talking about today, which is our U.S.-Canadian relations. So shortly after Trump, as you all know, I'm just sort of saying things that we all have been thinking, why is this happening? Trump took office, he started talking about a 51st state. He then talked about Canada being a gateway for fentanyl and also illegal immigrants. He started levying high taxes, sorry. Um, and things have been very icy since then. And so I think we're all wondering what's going on? Why is this happening? So we turn to our speakers to give us more insight as to maybe the why and also what the implications of this are and where they see this going. But before we do that, let me just go over a little bit of the ground rules. We are, as you know, on Zoom. We are therefore also on demand. And so we welcome you who are our viewers who join us not at this time live, but at other times. The panelists will be leading with questions. The speakers will talk for about 35 minutes or so. Um, and then after the panelists ask questions, please be during this time entering your comments into the chat box. And what isn't covered, we will try to cover within the chat so that we can give a wide range of discussion to topics that may not come up by the panelists. So without wanting to hold us up on our program further, let me turn this over to Carolyn Resnick, who is our team leader who will be hosting our two speakers. and to introduce them. So, Carolyn.
Oh, thank you, June. Thank you, Joan. I'm so glad that you're okay. And to reiterate what June said, we're going to miss you terribly. Um, so as people we volunteer in this committee to find topics, to find speakers and so forth. And since I have both Canadian and American family and go back and forth all the time, I volunteered to find somebody who would talk about Canadian American relations. And I have two wonderful speakers. Brendan Shanahan is an associate research scholar, Committee on Canadian Studies, Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies, Yale. He's a lecturer and in history at Yale as well, and he's published numerous articles. And Oxford University Press just published his first book, Disparate Regimes, Alienage Law, Citizen Rights, and the United States, 1865 to 1965. He's joined by Drew Fagan, who is also currently part of the Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale. He's on a Fulbright visiting professorship. He is permanently a professor at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, University of Toronto, which is one of the leading schools of foreign affairs in North America. He spent, before joining the monk school, he spent 12 years in teaching leading positions with the governments of Ontario and Canada, so he knows whereof he speaks. In Ottawa, he served as Assistant Deputy Minister for Strategic Policy and Planning, Global Affairs Canada. He served as the Deputy Minister of Infrastructure for the Government of Ontario. He has been on numerous government panels and authored many, many reports. And before he became a public servant, he was a reporter for the Globe and Mail, and he continues to serve on various government, business, and nonprofit boards. And Drew, I apologize if I have left out some very important aspects of your curriculum vitae, but it's so long and it's so horribly, wonderfully, not horribly, it's wonderfully impressive that I decided just to summarize it. So I'm going to turn it over to Brendan and Drew and let them talk, and then we will certainly welcome comments and questions. So thank you.
Um, Thank you very, very much. Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining us. It's a real pleasure and privilege to speak to and with all of you today. Thanks to Carolyn for this wonderful invitation, and to Joan for running point on logistics both before and during this very tumultuous day. And thanks to both of you. Drew, thanks for letting a historian share the stage with you to provide historical context for a discussion of deep contemporary significance, but I do hope some deep history provides useful content and context. And to all of you in the audience, I look forward to what I really hope will be a two-way conversation. As you just heard, my name's Brendan Shanahan. I am not the famous hockey player from Canada, though I am indeed named after him. And I teach U.S. and Canadian history with an emphasis on topics pertaining to immigration and citizenship, U.S.-Canada relations, and comparative politics here at Yale. And as Carolyn was just saying, I recently published my first book, Disparate Regimes, Nativist Politics, Alienage Law, and Citizenship Rights in the United States, 1865-1965, with Oxford University Press. That book is pretty squarely in U.S. Immigration and citizenship history, often dealing with other topics of pretty deep contemporary significance, with topics like dealing with histories of, say, disputes over the inclusion of a census citizenship question, and the rights of non-citizens to work in various blue-collar and professional fields of employment. And given my training and interest, Canadians and U.S.-Canada connections appears a fair bit in that book, and I'll draw from it if and when it is useful today in my remarks. However, I'll principally be leaning into newer work that I'm doing in U.S.-Canada relations in the long 19th century, a topic I'm just wrapping up teaching a class about this term. Two of the books that I treated as textbooks of sorts for my recent class, Robert Bothwell's Your Country, My Country, A Unified History of the United States and Canada, and Jay Sexton's The Monroe Doctrine, empire, and nation in 19th century America will particularly inform my remarks, and I'd be happy to talk more about any readings that you might be interested in during that Q&A period. And because I'm going to be trying to cover roughly 2 centuries plus of U.S.-Canada relations and their impact on U.S. and Canadian respective politics in about 10, 15 minutes, 20 max, I can't cover everything. And indeed, that's a course in its own right, one that I really love teaching. So I'm happy to elaborate at length in the Q&A about topics that I only appear in brief or those that don't come up at all. So let's get started. Throughout Canadian history, the exchange of goods and peoples across the US-Canadian border has been both an inevitability. The US is simply going to be one of, if not Canada's always principal trading partner, and will always be its largest neighbor, and a key to propelling Canada's economy. But given the outside weight of that US-Canada relationship, managing it remains a fundamental challenge for Canadian leaders and voters to ensure the country's legal and practical sovereignty, and has always been. Canadian policymakers and voters are constantly trying to strike the right balance, well aware that moves in one arena, such as towards greater economic integration, might threaten to upend the balance in the other arena of de facto and de jure sovereignty. For the United States, this US-Canada relationship has always been a key one, both in bilateral terms, US, Canada, just 2 countries, or in multilateral terms, US, Canada in broader international context. But that relationship has never been as inseparable to the overall American political economy as it has been for Canada and Canadians. Put another way, in Canada, the US-Canadian relationship has always been a key topic of Canadian federal politics, with several past elections hinging on the question of who's going to best manage the US-Canada file, including the most recent Canadian federal election earlier this year. In the US, that has never been the case, though sometimes questions relevant to US-Canada relations, think NAFTA, have been folded into foremost topics of national debate. But American voters have never gone to the polls wondering which presidential candidate is best going to manage the US-Canada relationship in the same way that Canadian voters weigh candidates and parties to govern their country. This underlying dynamic, on the one hand, the relative might of the United States, and on the other, the disproportionate focus and attention that Canadians place on this relationship have provided opportunities and challenges for policymakers and voters in both countries. For instance, the threat of military conquest, coerced political union, and or economic and cultural subordination have often served as a unifying force for Canadians at different points in Canada's national history. But the large shadow cast by the United States has, at other times, heightened the country's internal divisions, and it has done so since the American Revolution. Indeed, often forgotten today, the U.S. Declaration of Independence dealt directly with Canada. The Quebec Act of 1774, passed by British Parliament, which enlarged the borders of Quebec and guaranteed linguistic and religious protections to French Canadian Catholics within its borders, was explicitly cited as one of the outrages inflicted upon the American colonies and colonists that justified American independence. But shortly thereafter, the Articles of Confederation extended an open invitation for those same residents of Quebec to join in the fun and potentially become the 14th state of this rebellious new country. Ben Franklin even went up to Montreal to invite Quebecers to join the rebellion, but he didn't go alone. He was preceded by an invading army of Yankees, a major unit of which was led by the namesake of New Haven's Little Italy neighborhood, Wooster Square, one General David Wooster. The failure of that military invasion of Quebec by Yankee forces and a lack of an upsurge in revolutionary sentiment by French Canadian Catholics kept Quebec and more broadly the other parts of British North America within the British Empire as the 13 colonies went the other direction. In the wake of the American War of Independence, British policymakers and colonial officials north of the emerging U.S. Border confronted a principal challenge of building a robust population, particularly in what is today Ontario, so that the remaining portions of British North America wouldn't be swallowed up by this new American republic. Who is going to populate it? Well, for their settler colonial project, they looked to loyalists, U.S. Residents who had opposed the American Revolution, and many so-called late loyalists, American-born former British subjects who decided for political and or economic reasons to return to live under the British flag in subsequent years. Here again, this exchange of peoples was seen as an opportunity for Canadian and British authorities on the one hand, but also a dangerous one, with many worrying that the growing population of present-day Ontario was becoming too American and a potential fifth column. Those questions came to the fore during and after the War of 1812, with that second invasion by American armies and another failed conquest of Canada. While there was not a major upsurge of fifth colonist American-born residents of Ontario, the threat and tensions arising from it led British leaders to increasingly try to direct British and sometimes Irish, often Irish Protestant migrants towards Canada as a key portion of the growing Canadian population. In part just to boost its population overall, but also to lessen the overall percentage of the American-born percentage of the population of the emerging what today we call Ontario. Later rebellions in what are today Quebec and Ontario in 1837 and 1838, which included cross-border raids and retreats by Canadian rebels to the United States, kept British authorities wary of deepening Canadian ties with the United States. Indeed, it wasn't until the sectional crisis over slavery in the United States in the 1850s, with deepening divides in American politics over questions over the expansion of slavery and anti-slavery politics, that Canadian and British authorities took the risk and skillfully negotiated an advantageous trade reciprocity deal between the United States and British North America, as the attention of American lawmakers turned insular over this approaching a crisis that would culminate in the Civil War, turning away America's attentions from questions of manifest destiny, which had hitherto often looked north of the border. So here, at a particular point of American relative weakness, Canadian and British authorities use that as an opportunity to negotiate a trade deal. But during and in the wake of the U.S. Civil War, renewed American might and strained relations with Britain and Canada, which were seen by many American Northerners of having been too sympathetic to the cause of the Confederacy, led to the termination of that trade deal and boosted demands by many Northern American politicians to annex all or parts of Canada as a perceived compensation for Anglo slights towards the North in the Civil War. While that U.S. invasion did not occur, bands of Irish American nationalists known as the Fenians did try to provoke an Anglo-American war by launching border raids against Canada. The idea there being if they could provoke a war, a crisis between the U.S. and Canada that would ensnare Great Britain, there would be this Anglo-American war, and out of that somehow an independent Ireland might emerge. That project also famously did not succeed, but the crisis and this threat of American invasion was a key impetus for the creation of the polity today we know as Canada, with Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia founding the Confederation of Canada in 1867, soon to be joined by British Columbia and Prince Edward Island. In the generation or so that follows Canadian Confederation in 1867, Canadian national politics would largely continue to divide over whether deepening economic relations with the United States, and to what degree, was possible, or whether doing so would risk or potentially preordain loss of Canadian sovereignty vis-a-vis the much larger American Republic to itself. And in the first several decades of Canadian Confederation, the pro-tariff Conservative Party dominated Canadian national politics, promoting settler colonialism in the West, a transcontinental railroad as a means of linking Canada's regions and subjugating its First Nations populations, and continued close imperial ties as its platform to win election and re-election again and again. The more laissez-faire and pro-free trade Liberal Party, by contrast, only governed for a handful of years, often tied in the eyes of the marginal voters in Canada with being soft on questions of standing up to the United States. It wouldn't be until 1896, amid a deep economic recession and a fracture within the Canadian Conservative Party, that the Liberals would finally come to win a considerable number of elections. By 1911, after having won several of those elections, the longtime Liberal Prime Minister of Canada, Sir Wilfrid Laurier, took the risk of negotiating a proposed trade reciprocity deal with the United States. He made the deal with President William Howard Taft, who famously vacationed regularly in Canada, was very, very closely attuned to Canada and had deep affection for it. And Laurier goes to the polls in the 1911 Canadian election, thinking we've negotiated a good deal with the Americans. This is going to re-elect us to office. But Canadian voters and some American politicians had other ideas in mind. Once more, the Conservatives warned that a free trade, a trade reciprocity deal with the United States threatened Canadian autonomy and would leave Canadians weakened against the Americans. And those warnings were given further credence when several U.S. lawmakers, including the soon-to-be Speaker of the House of Representatives, overtly embraced the idea that a trade deal would lead to future Canadian annexation. Voters in Canada elected the Conservatives, threw the Liberals out of office, and threw that trade deal in the trash heap for several decades thereafter in Canadian politics. Continued tensions and strains in U.S.-Canada relations would continue with a slow U.S. entry into World War I compared to Canada joining right away as part of the British Empire, exacerbating some of those dimensions. In fact, I talk about that in my own new book, when a Canadian-born foreign school teacher was about to lose her job in California when that state had a policy of saying you had to be a citizen to have a job like that. And she turned her this case into a cause célèbre in Canada, and actually succeeded in putting such pressure on U.S. Diplomats that she saved her job and that of many other immigrant public school teachers in California. By 1917, with the U.S. entering the war, American relations, and particularly government-to-government relations with Canada and the United States, is increasingly deepening. Though tariffs don't come down in the wake of World War I, U.S. business investment in Canada does continue to deepen, with American businesses establishing branch plants in Canada to navigate those tariff barriers. But as in the United States, the Great Depression would hit Canada very hard in the 1930s. And it wasn't until World War II and wartime industrial boom and surge of manpower to the military and accompanying military projects that Canada and the U.S. would finally overcome the Great Depression and really deepen U.S. and Canadian economic relations, often military relations, and government-to-government connections. Indeed, the conclusion of that war and the beginning of the Cold War give rise to, in many ways, the modern era of U.S.-Canada relations, one of overlapping and interlocking partnerships usually led by the United States, but ones in which Canada plays a key role and is recognized as a fully sovereign nation state vis-a-vis the United States and Great Britain, no longer requiring authorization from London to negotiate trade deals or the like with the United States. Here, think things like NORAD, the increased military cooperation in the defense of the North American continent, and how we get to track Santa on Christmas Eve, but also things like the United Nations and NATO. However, even into the mid to late 20th century, strains in U.S.-Canada relations pop up. Canada joins in the Korean War, not in the Vietnam War. Though Canadian voters increasingly approve of deepening U.S.-Canada relations on topics like NATO, questions remain volatile over the degree to which American missiles should be stationed in Canada's north. Canadian politicians remain on guard also against perceived threats to Canadian cultural autonomy, both linguistic and the programming on TV and radio, to really assert that Canada can be closely allied to, but must remain distinct in its identity from that of the United States. Canadian policymakers also in the 60s and 70s took significant actions to try to prevent the so-called brain drain of professionals, largely Montreal, Toronto, down to higher paying positions south of the border in cities like New York, Boston, and the like. By the 1980s, with just as American voters elect right-wing governments and under President Reagan, and British voters elect Margaret Thatcher and successive conservative governments there, Canadian voters, for the first time in nearly a century, elected back-to-back majority conservative governments in the 1980s, led by Brian Mulroney. Mulroney had deep close personal relations with both Presidents Reagan and Bush Sr., and shared this common neoliberal ideology, and used those personal connections and that ideological shared affinity to negotiate a truly free trade deal in the late 1980s, and that would later be expanded into NAFTA in the early 90s. This meant that, in a flip from what had happened in 1911, it was the conservatives in Canada proposing deepening economic ties with the United States, with the Liberals and a more further left third party, the New Democrats, warning that deepening integration with the American economy was a risk, posed risks to Canadian autonomy and workers' jobs. The Conservatives win the relevant election, but notably only by a plurality. Once free trade was policy, however, the Liberals would flip, accept that new paradigm, and ever since, free trade has become the bulwark of Canadian political economic planning and key to the national economy of Canada and one of ever deepening ties. This new century has again seen ever deepening U.S.-Canadian political and economic, state-to-state ties and economic ties, but have also not been without strain, as was the case in the Cold War. Canada joins in and plays a key role in the war on terror in Afghanistan, but does not participate in the Iraq War, again, much akin to the Korean War and Vietnam War. The successful renegotiation of the U.S., Canada, Mexico free trade deal by the Trudeau government under the first Trump administration, I suspect will likely be seen as one of the signature accomplishments of Justin Trudeau's government. While the steady decline of Prime Minister Trudeau's popularity had some things to do with his management of the U.S.-Canada file, think lengthy COVID-era border restrictions and the protests it engendered. That's not why the Liberal Party of Canada was languishing in a distant third place in polls this time last year. That is, until Canada became the focus of US and Canadian politics when the threat of annexation was revived for the first time in roughly a century. But for that, I'm going to let someone more expert in contemporary Canadian politics and contemporary US-Canada relations speak all about that. Thanks.
So thanks, Brendan, and thanks all of you, June, Joan, Carolyn, toute la gang, for inviting us. It's been so much fun, to be at Yale. I got there mid-September. I'm there till mid-May, as was mentioned as the Fulbright scholar there. Long history with regard to that position. I'm actually not a career as I think Carolyn said, I'm not a career academic. This is kind of a third career, an overtime career. I spent the first half of my career at the Globe and Mail, which some of you will know as the major Canadian paper. I was the correspondent in Washington in the 1990s. I took to just saying I was sometimes calling from the Globe, and sometimes people would mistake it for the Boston Globe, and that worked on occasion, only a couple times. I'm kidding. Anyway, so it's great to be back and living in the States and teaching this stuff. I teach basically because of my career in government, second career in government, how policy is done, really done. What constitutes the steps? What are the steps to do policy well? And what are the steps that ensure the policy is done poorly? And we can all think examples of that. I'm actually teaching it in the next term in the context of Canada-US relations. And at the Jackson School, which is the equivalent of the Monk School at U of T, University of Toronto. So a little bit of context, and you just got a tour de force, in 15 minutes of the history of relations. And I'm going to drill down on the present in the context of what Brendan just did in terms of contextualizing it. And I'll add some context just to begin with. Canadians think of their economy. They don't think of the country, its size as small. It's obviously not. You can't miss that. The problem is it's huge and there aren't as many people to populate the place. But anybody who's been in northern Canada knows that that's tough going. 90% of the population lives, 100 miles from the border. And all know that. Its population's over 40 million people now. It's growing, in fact, faster than the United States. It's one of the fastest growing populations in the world. That's been controversial, particularly controversial in recent years because of a strain of immigration that was irregular, which has been a problem throughout U.S. history, not so much from the northern border as the southern border, the things going on. The other thing is it's the 10th biggest economy in the world. It's the size of Brazil. It's the size of Spain. It's actually the size of Russia. What Russia manages to do with an economy the size of Canada kind of is a striking thing, mostly for ill and energy dominated. It's politics, and there are strains of Canadian history that some would define as anti-American. Some would say that we're the original anti-Americans, given what Brendan said about the English population being founded essentially by loyalists, the 20% of Americans who didn't support the revolution, roughly. We're basically all Democrats. So why Trump would want to annex us is a good question in terms of domestic politics. If we only got one state, okay, but that state would actually be the size of California's in the Electoral College, so it doesn't make a heck of a lot of sense on that size. And as Brendan noted, there's long history with regard to the sensibility of annexation going back to the Monroe Doctrine. Some of you are all of you probably are keeping up with things. You'll have noticed the Trump, what did he call it? The Trump corollary of the Monroe Doctrine and the national security strategy, which is worth reading. Yeah, which is worth reading to sort of get a sense of the mentality of the government. The other thing that's worth noting is the depth of ties, not just trade, I'll talk about that, but the depth of intergovernmental, regulatory, sectoral ties of coordination. The most obvious one is NORAD. There is no, NATO's far well better known, but the defense of North America and the fact that it's bilateral, we're the little sibling by far. Too much in the eyes of this administration and frankly previous administrations. Obama was talking about that. I'm happy to talk about military spending. We're a bit of a free rider, admittedly. But actually, on 9/11, it's a well noted fact that the commander sitting in the chair at NORAD was Canadian. The United States doesn't actually take steps by this easily to not globalize, but expand its sense of sovereignty beyond its borders. Canada is one of the very few countries, and the country with whom the United States has done this more than anyone else. It started in 1909 with the International Joint Commission. It makes sense because of the border and the degree of ties in terms of water resources. So I'm going to take it just with that as kind of an opener. I'm going to take it from 1988 and the era of free trade. Brendan talked about the degree to which this has been a fundamental aspect of Canadian history from before Confederation in 1867. Probably as primordial for Canada or close as French-English relations. And in those circumstances, we have had two referenda on independence in Quebec. So you can see how fraught it is and how important. Free trade was described as a leap of faith on the Canadian side of the border. Why? The economics by that point were pretty obvious that it made economic sense to integrate more closely with the United States, to eliminate tariffs, which by that point in the 1980s were small. One thing that it was going to do is it was supposed to inoculate us, Canada, from protectionist sentiment in the United States. And it was supposed to set up a regime in which you know, the big dog couldn't use their power over the small players. So you would decide trade disputes as on the facts as opposed to raw power. And we got that in the free trade agreement. Again, to go back to the sensibility of bilateralism that doesn't exist with any other country. That the United States has very few free trade agreements. Why? Well, part of the reason is they don't need them. You don't need them. The domestic economy is so strong. So the degree of your economy that's dependent on trade generally is smaller than any other Western country, 12, 13, 14, 15%. For Canada, um, naturally, it's almost like water flowing to a certain degree. If you bring down the barriers at the border, it's going to flow south. Why? Well, that's where the people are. That's where the opportunity is. And if you look at trade analysis, you can see that there's a big impact on trade ties with regard to things as simple as distance. So it's before the free trade agreement, 75% of Canadian exports went to the United States. Today, 75% of Canadian exports go to the United States. So all the Sturm and Drang of 1988 election, 1994 election agreement on NAFTA, which frankly the debate over NAFTA never really ended, although the debate in Canada over free trade, which was very emotional in 1988, which Brendan underlined, did end to a sizable extent. And as time went on, the east-west ties of Canada economically attenuated, and the north-south ties of Canada-US grew. Now, I just said 75% to 75%. Did I contradict myself? No, it's a bigger percentage GDP. But my point is simply that in terms of our total trade, goods, services, exports, imports, the totality of the Canada-US relationship, it's grown hugely. It grew in particular in the first half of the era. It grew in particular between 1989, when the free trade went into effect, and 2001. What happened in 2001? 9/11 happened in 2001. And one of the things that Canada never considered and we had the best possible people. If you're dealing with the United States, you take the A team. Hey, in Washington, when you're dealing with Canada, you might bring the B team. You might at times take the A team. Like you've got the whole world to worry about. Canada, less so. We're a middle power, as we like to call ourselves. So 9/11 did gum up the border permanently because we never really thought about the border in security terms in the context of the free trade negotiation. So, in fact, over the last 10, 12 years, as Canada and US ties have started to pose challenges, particularly in Trump 1 first term. Our trade with Asia, our trade with Europe, we've been conscious of the need simply to take greater advantage in the best way of rising markets, Asia in particular, getting our energy to Asia, not exclusively to the United States, taking better advantage of the European market. So we've signed free trade agreements with both of those areas. The TPP, remember that, which Trump, it was one of the steps he took his first day in Trump 1 was to ensure that you weren't going to be part of TPP. We did become part of TPP. It was a natural thing to do. And we have a free trade agreement with Europe. The United States, I can remember United States and Europe were talking about a free trade agreement in the mid 1990s. Never happened, not on the agenda now. But actually, over the last 10 years, our exports to both those regions have grown faster than our exports to the United States. So if we think about Canada strategically and this government, the Carney government, liberal in name, but small c conservative to a sizable extent economically, and more liberal socially in the Canadian tradition, as opposed to the Trudeau government, which was a left of center government, right? So, thinking about a three-legged stool of building the domestic economy, those east-west ties becoming more productive. We have a productivity challenge, especially vis-a-vis the United States, actually. Building our ties globally and maintaining our ties with the United States. Nobody in Canada wants to cut off our ties with the United States. We're not suicidal, but what we are trying to do is manage them in the context of a very, very difficult administration, which not just difficult in terms of protectionist, nativist, um, not isolationist necessarily, but has strains of that, but also trying to read the tea leaves of what's going on in a bilateral negotiation in which it appears as if the administration wants to make it as difficult as possible for its northern neighbor, and so we kind of, the population generally shake our head and go, what's going on here? If you can't get along with Canada, what's going on? I'm kind of joking, but only so much. So free trade was successful. Free trade was successful for the United States as well as for Canada. It wasn't primordial for the United States like it was for Canada because, just because of the context. Our economy is right now less than 10%. You always use that 10% number, 10% of the population. It's actually Canada's 11% now. 10% of the economy, right now it's 9%, depends on the exchange rate, whatever. It's always that factor of 10, divide or multiply, right? And so, of course, it's going to be more important for us than it is for the United States, but it's beneficial for the United States all the time, all the same. And if you look at the statistics with regard to that, where the exports and imports go, the degree to which there's benefit in terms of overall competitiveness in particular sectors and a whole range of factors, you'll see that it's not unimportant. It's actually beneficial to the United States and you can track it. It's just not nearly as important. I like to say that very simply, the relationship is symbiotic but asymmetrical, and underline the symbiotic, because that's what's being lost here. Even with all the reasonable complaints that the United States can make with regard to defense spending at a time when the world has again become a jungle, and others, including protectionist, outwardly protectionist actions that Canada undertakes. And I can provide all sorts of examples of that, whether it's dairy or telecom or banking or whatever, in a context in which Canada's always tried to balance sovereignty and autonomy and distinctiveness, the northern half of North America, with integration with the United States. And I think that's something that the Trump administration, most administrations kind of eventually figured out. And I'm sure that's something that the Trump administration has very little patience for. So Trump won. There was a sensibility of competition. I talked to people. I just started at the Monk School. I was doing some writing, did a piece for the New York Times on this, like, what's going on here? Let's remember that NAFTA, what does NAFTA stand for? North American Free Trade Agreement. What did the bilateral agreement in 1988, Canada-US Free Trade Agreement? By the way, Reagan agreed that the word Canada would come first. He loved Canada, and he would talk about it. He would say that Brian Mulroney, and he can't say no to Brian Mulroney. Well, okay. What does CUSMA stand for, which is the way Canada terms it? Canada-US-Mexico Agreement. USMCA, what does that stand for? Well, So one, there's no commonality with regard to what the name of the agreement is. What's missing? The term North America is not in the agreement. The term free trade is not in the agreement. So all we managed to do, in effect, was update NAFTA, take out some of the symbolism, which the president insisted on, and in addition, do something that NAFTA really didn't have, which was a compulsory review. That was the word, review of the agreement 6 years after it went into effect. 6 years, which is fairly quick. And that date is July 1st, 2026. So Trump 2 gets into a whole different level of, I would say, U.S. Imposed animosity. Annexation, which was seen by Canadians as simply a lack of respect for what is a sovereign country. Now, I'm an integrationist, always have been, and there's a whole bunch of integrationists that I'm working with, and we're all shocked by what's going on here. And I can talk about more history on annexation and things like that. That's really interesting. But it's more than moving from allies and friends to competitors to a greater extent in Trump 1, to really antagonists, except that Canadians don't want to be antagonists. Like, I've always thought that a good way to think about the relationship is coordinate when you can, compete when you must. And what's come back at us is not only are we solely competitors, at least in economic terms, but we're unfair competitors for which there's no real evidence, really. The relationship is balanced in terms of trade, and the only thing that unbalances is the degree to which the United States buys Canadian energy. That's what unbalances it. And, it's not like you don't want that energy. So it's a balanced relationship. The relationship is more complicated elsewhere, but, in certain ways, but it's a balanced relationship. And it's something else. Let's use autos as an example. Now, in the first decade, 15 years of free trade, autos and auto parts, central Canada, Southern Ontario, Michigan, and more broadly, not exclusively so, but broadly, was the biggest bilateral trade product. It's not now, it's now energy. And the United States ships a lot of energy to Canada, by the way, especially in Eastern Ontario. So if you have Donald Trump convinced and speaking openly that the Canadian auto industry effectively should be closed because it's unfair to the United States, it's runaway production. This has been a bilateral industry, cross-border industry since we started making cars. Now, there were Canadian auto companies that got bought up, as there were many American auto companies. We remember the names that got bought up by the big three. Japanese automakers situated themselves from the 1980s on in Canada. I'm about 30 miles away from the biggest the Honda production in Alliston, Ontario. Lots in the United States as well. It's not runaway production. It was always a bilateral sector. But as we think about autos now, in a context in which the president and the administration is going to do everything they can politically to pressure the big three and others to situate themselves on the American side of the border, we got to think, Canada has to think a couple of things. One, that's not really what we signed up for. And two, they're going to succeed. We just don't have the throw power. The 10th biggest economy in the world doesn't mean a lot in a context like that. So I was at a dinner on Saturday night back at the Monk School with colleagues, and we were talking about the auto sector. And I've been doing this a lot. And, its challenges going forward and how it's fundamental because it's a big driver of the biggest part of the Canadian economy. So, three-legged stool. Mark Carney is a pro governor of the Bank of Canada, governor of the Bank of England, first non-British citizen. I guess he is a British citizen. His wife is British. But anyway, first expatriate, I guess, to ever take that position, I think is true. And many years at Goldman Sachs in New York, knows his way around that world. A big player, always been thinking about politics, and he meets the moment. And he defeats the Conservatives, who had been up by 20% in the polls before all this started. He has a minority government. He's within one seat of a majority. He'll probably get to find a way to woo a couple more Conservatives to cross the floor and change parties, which will give him the stability of a majority government, which Canadians want. They don't want fighting inside the tent, given what's facing us on the other side, of the tent, if you will. The context of the negotiations in some ways feel like bad faith, to be perfectly honest. You enter into a negotiation and you kind of, sort of temper yourself in terms of the acts that you could take to increase the pressure during that negotiation. This would not have been done in 1987 or 1993. But the tariffs that have been imposed, which are certainly against the not just the image, but the sort of context of and the spirit of the free trade agreement, and they are under under legal challenge as well. Change the dynamic to a certain extent. It is hurting the Canadian economy, just as the latest evidence shows it's hurting the U.S. economy, but hurting the Canadian economy more, given our dependence on the United States. So, what's going to happen? Well, they're negotiating on tariffs. We're changing our ambassador in Washington. She's been a trooper, Kirsten Hillman. She's been there 8 years. Mark Wiseman, who's kind of like Carney in terms of a finance guy, has worked in New York, kind of same cut as Mark Carney and other people around him, will become the ambassador. Only one job. Only one requirement: being a good negotiator in the context of working with the Commerce Secretary and even the President. The question is how those tariffs negotiations interlace with the review of CUSMA that's required beginning on July 1st. So let me give you three scenarios, and then I'll kind of, I'll turn it over to you. So, weak politics for Trump. He's at 36% in the polls I saw yesterday. Let's say that continues. Let's say that the impact of tariffs on the Midwest and elsewhere continue to be substantial, and he's not seeing a bump in the polls as the midterms get closer. Does he then put this behind him? And does Canada then give him a couple of, sort of Gainsburgers in terms of increased dairy trade, promises of investment, as the EU, Japan, South Korea did, more stringent rules on auto trade, and you call it a deal, and we see where things are in 6 years. And Canada focuses on those other two legs of the stool as well, but that gives us some stability. And we'll see. Scenario two, the politics looks better for Trump, and he continues to fight over this. And maybe, there was reporting last week from the U.S. trade representative who put on the table the idea of ending on 6 months' notice. You can terminate the free trade agreement and then negotiating sectoral agreements with the two parties, Mexico and Canada, separately. That was kind of the nightmare of NAFTA. After we had free trade, we didn't want a hub and spoke relationship, so Canada entered those negotiations with Mexico. But everything's out in the open now, so we will see. So I'd give 50% to the first scenario. Given the polling now, I'd give 40%, 30%, maybe, in between to the second. Let's do the third. I think, to be honest, Donald Trump, in his heart of hearts, would love to annex Canada. I think he thinks in terms of the map. There's really no benefit to it. These are bygone days, but he changed the name of the Gulf of Mexico. This is the kind of stuff that he thinks about. Would he have much of a fight? Thomas Jefferson said it's just a matter of marching in 1812. It didn't turn out to be that. There was fighting. A third scenario in which this goes on and on. The tariffs are increased. Canada eventually sues for peace in some sort of, I doubt annexation, but some kind of, condominium relationship. I give that 5%, 10%, but it's not impossible under the circumstance. That's what he's thinking. 250th anniversary is next year. Wouldn't he love fireworks over that? That's, and so I don't entirely rule it out. Although the governing class in Canada certainly doesn't think it's realistic. I don't think it's realistic either, by and large, but I don't think the odds are zero. Final point. And that is, I'm going to be teaching a course on comparative public policy, Canada and the United States. And it's great that you guys are doing this. One of the things about American exceptionalism, and there's so many strains of it and so many impacts, and reasonable given, sort of size and scope of the United States. Americans don't focus enough on comparative public policy. There's so much to learn from Canada, and vice versa. We're consciously thinking about it in terms of healthcare, in terms of social policy, issues of income inequality, and issues that we can learn from you with regard to, frankly, productivity and the core of the economy. And we're just the next director of the Monk School is an American coming up from Stanford. He's very conscious of that. He and I were talking the other day of the learnings for Social Security, which, as you know, is in deep financial trouble. And in 2035, they'd have to reduce the checks for Americans, and the reform of the Canada Pension Plan, which happened in 1998 and again in 2018 and is actuarially solid through 2070. So I encourage you, and I'm doing this in my class, to think a little bit more about Canada, and because we certainly do with the United States, and there's actually an interesting kind of symbiosis that's possible. I'm not unreasonable. I recognize, that America is, a land unto itself in so many ways. But there's learnings there. Anyway, thank you very much for the invitation, and turn it over for discussion, I hope.
Thank you, Drew. Thank you, Brandon. That was marvelous. And can you see me? I'm not sure.
I
Not
can't,
yet.
but I can hear you fine.
Trouble with my phone here.
I can hear you fine, Carol.
Mhm.
You
Yeah,
can hear
we
me?
can't
Okay.
see you, but yeah,
Um,
we hear you well.
I had you know what? Given that I'm having trouble, is there anybody else who has questions in the interim that they would like to ask either of our speakers? I have a
Yeah,
couple.
I've got one. Yeah.
Yeah, okay, go ahead, Tyler. Yeah.
Okay. Um, yeah, well, great summary of what's going on. Thank you very much. And I certainly hope that your option number 3 does not materialize. But oh my gosh.
Yes.
I'm just curious, internally, is Mark Carney doing well with the general population in the sense that he's got rising, I gather from what I read, rising unemployment, which is now, I think, over 7%. And in the southern part of the country, when Windsor and the auto producing areas is up over 11%. I just wonder, is he endangered in his efforts to kind of smooth things with Trump and get the tariff issues ironed out, or is he on tenuous ground?
So let me address the sort of political situation at home, and then touch on maybe the relationship with Trump. They're both, they come together as you just described them. Um, so there was a poll the other day that showed the party's pretty close. But Carney's within one seat of a majority. There's not going to be an election anytime soon. He knows, the people around him know, that this is a time for both vision and balance and maturity, and I think by and large he's got that. This is also a country of regions. The United States is like that, but it's even to a greater extent. It's that aspect is expanded by Quebec, where he did pretty well in the election. His French isn't bad. That he got a pass a little bit. It's not as good as previous prime ministers, but he got a pass. So he's solid, and the country is looking to him right now. They bet on a big brain with global respectability, who came, I don't want to say out of the blue, because he's been circling this for a long time, but he met his moment. Now, I'm going to say something about the politics of it. Everybody around him is cut in the same way. They're technocrats. He is the head of the public service, is one of Canada's most respected business people who's been around public policy and government as well. Some of his ministers who he recruited in are people from Bay Street, the equivalent of Wall Street up here, and others. They need to be really careful about the politics of this. They can't sort of leave that to others, because something will catch them out. But yes, they're solid. They're solid. And there won't be an election for a while. And the next election, I think, will end up being another referendum on relations with the United States and what's been happening with other steps. And he's done a lot of stuff in terms of negotiations with other countries. He's warmed up relations with India. He's warmed up relations with China. He's done deals with Europe. At a certain point, the Trump administration might find some of them problematic, but we'll see the reaction there. In terms of his relations with Trump, Trump just, plays this, right? He stopped negotiations, which had been making progress on the tariffs, because the Premier of Ontario bought advertising, criticizing the US government in October. I think one ran during the World Series, actually, which remains painful, by the way. And you know, so so that's weird. That's weird. The one of the glories of the American system is its openness. Again, it's exceptional. You can lobby Congress, you can lobby the states, you can do anything, right? And then here you have an administration that says, they're imposing on our sovereignty because they're advertising. That wasn't the game either, right? So Carney's trying to feel his way with Trump, just as Mexican President Sheinbaum is doing, and everybody is doing, right? In terms of trying to get a deal that they can live with and move on. But it's like every day is a new Every day is a new moment.
Yeah. Hopefully, Doug Ford's advertisement, which caused a ruffle, will fade into the background.
Well,
Possibly, yeah, yeah, possibly.
it keeps getting raised by
Hmm.
the U.S. ambassador, who's a former Republican congressman from Michigan.
Hmm.
It'll fade eventually, but the reaction to it
Yeah.
was untoward in my mind. It wasn't consistent with American,
Oh, it
what
was
makes America
absurd.
special.
Yeah,
Absurd. Yeah.
I just have a few things to add
Yeah.
onto the points that Drew you were addressing. I think Tyler, you've got your finger on the pulse here about the question that is going to be the one that we have to watch in the next year, 2, 3 years, as the life of this parliament and Carney's time in office endures. Right now, though, the polls are pretty neck and neck, or with liberals with narrow leads, and we're in election held today, that sort of thing. Carney is decisively more popular than his leading opponent, Poilievre, in head-to-head polls. So that was the measure that the pollsters identified as in the last election, just 6-9 months ago, as more or less allowing the third and fourth parties, because it's a multi-party system in Canada, a lot of voters who usually might vote for the center left to left wing NDP transferred over to Carney to stop Poilievre, and similarly in Quebec. And for now, Carney is holding up very well vis-a-vis Poilievre. Poilievre, the leader of the Conservative Party, is trying to make the other issues, particularly questions of affordability, which had been his calling cards when it was head-to-head Poilievre versus Trudeau, had been his the issues that had led him to leading by double digits this time just last year, right? Like this time last year, it looked like the Conservatives were going to win a historically large majority before Carney replaced Trudeau. I think this is indeed the question. For now, Drew's absolutely right. Not only does Carney have the most stable type of a minority government you can have, you prefer to have a majority, he might pick up his majority just by floor crossers alone. And the Conservatives do not want to have an election today because their leader is up for a review. So Poilievre might be out of a job himself in a couple of months if he loses the base of his party. So all of those pieces are moving day to day, which in turn give Carney a strong position in the immediate future. But if these negotiations continue or they get kicked down the road for another 6 months, let's say there's an extension on tariff pauses, but there's no resolution, and Canada has a greater housing crisis than the United States, questions of affordability, beyond 6 months, but a year, 2 years, 3 years. We don't have a crystal ball, but I would say that's the thing to keep our eye out on longer term.
Okay. All true. All
Yeah.
true. Perfect, Brendan. That's of the political situation. Let me throw, so I said there's not going to be an election. Let's say that in the springtime, a year in, as soon as that, let me contradict myself. And Brenda just did the analysis. basically what Carney promised was he's gonna stand hard against any sense of annexation and all that kind of stuff, and he'll do a good deal. Like he'll ensure that Canadian interests are protected and more in a negotiation. Let's say he can't deliver. Let's say that the deal looks problematic, but it is a deal, or something else. And he goes back to the public for a mandate. He says, times have changed again, and this is the best I can do. And, so I want a vote of support that you support me in one way or the other. Um, I think the population would move with him. And the thing about and Brendan's exactly right. Final point, and that is issues of affordability and issues of the United States and the relationship are not separate. They are intimately tied, and you can go to a number of border cities. You mentioned Windsor, Tyler. I could say Sault Ste. Marie further up across from the upper part of Michigan. What do they call it? The Upper Panhandle. Um, um, you know, eh, they're tied. So we'll see
Yeah.
where things go. If there's stability, he'll continue. If there's a
Yeah.
political advantage that the public is not going to be offended by, because essentially they're saying you need another mandate because times have changed, I think he'd win. He being Carney, and he'd have a majority.
Okay, let me just break in right now. We generally wind up at 11:15. I am telling you that I'm sure that everybody is enjoying this conversation, but I want to ask the two of you if you're able to continue, and then those who
Sure.
leave us,
Sure.
we're sorry, but this conversation
No
is really,
problem.
I think, a very important conversation. Um, so if that is all right with our
Yep.
speakers,
Sure.
those of you
Sure
who
thing.
want to continue with us, we're delighted to have you. If you have questions, those who leave us, we will be on demand and we will keep on taping so you can pick up later. So to our two speakers, are you all right
Yeah,
continuing?
Sure thing.
I'm good. I thought
Okay,
it went.
great.
Yeah, that's great.
So a question I have then, actually I have two, but let me start with the first is, do you think that the economic policies that the Trump administration is aiming at you are trying to force Canada into a situation where the populace may be more willing to look at annexation?
Drew, you want to go first?
No,
Yeah. Okay.
Brendan.
Again, this is where historians get in trouble when we try to predict things. But my read on it, as just from a political comparative politics perspective, would be um, that would be the most extreme goal if there were like a strategy in mind to set those dominoes in motion. But to Drew's point, I think the much more likely and the more pressing question on mind is just increase pressure, ramp up pressure, and use that pressure to extract concessions, knowing that if there is a trade war, day in day out, Canadians are going to hurt more again day in day out from the increased tariff barriers. Um, though, I point as a historian, I would point. That's why I spent so much time talking about past Canadian elections and politics that did center on questions of U.S.-Canada economic relations. Um, these were on offer explicitly in previous times of U.S. Canadian relations, where there'd be presidential administrations saying we would love to annex Canada, and questions of they were much more on the front burner, and Canadian voters at a time when the American economy was relatively even stronger relative to that of Canada's than it is today, rejected it. And while there were minority groups or factions within, say, the Liberal Party of Canada then that might have been amenable to it, today that's just a very small fraction of the Canadian voter populace. There's a contingent of it in Alberta that has a pretty far right wing faction within the provincial Conservative Party there, but it remains very very small relative to the overall national population. So if anywhere it were to appear, it would be at like trying to get into one province and to create chaos, I think, within its provincial system. That would be my read on it. Drew?
But yeah, but the United States is capable of that if they turn turn your mind to it. Again, it's not a small country. It's a big country. It's just not, it's a middleweight. The United States is a super heavyweight. It's the way that Canada has kind of always played this in a context, go back to its origins, loyalists, Quebecois, Indigenous. There's been a sensibility that were different. And those that weren't, we've always had a problem with brain drain, as New Zealand has with Australia on a much bigger scale. Go through the numbers and things like that. It's lower now than it always was, but the quality of people, given the education system and the wealth here that go to, as was mentioned earlier, New York or San Francisco and others, problematic in a sense, like the cream. So yeah, is it realistic? Depends on what did I give it? 5%? This is all extraordinary. In 2000, I've always been interested in this. In 2000, I did a series of stories for the Globe and Mail about stuff like this, because we were talking about deeper integration, context of customs union, context of common market. Brian Mulroney was in favor of a common market after his years in politics. I remember talking to him a number of times about this, 99, 2000, 2001. There was a poll, annual kind of end of year poll, 25% of Canadians were comfortable with annexation. Now it's down to half that. Who do you want to be annexed by? Trump or Obama. I mean, this is a crazy talk at a certain point. This is the time when annexation was at its most popular. Actually, doesn't. It was actually in the early 1890s, and there was a real annexation movement in Canada, particularly in the West and in border regions in the East. Windsor, the West, why? Because the response to annexation and the response to the United States ending the 12-year era of free trade just before Confederation, was to put up tariff walls and build a domestic economy. But the price of that is Western farmers sent their stuff to central Canada for production and then on, when it would have been so much cheaper to send it across the border. And that's still has an impact today in terms of regional resentment in the West. You'll hear it. And again, with regard to the regionalism of the country. But is Trump capable of putting enough pressure? We haven't even talked about defense on this country. He's capable of it. The United States is capable of it. Is it in its own interest to move in this direction? No, because they could get a lot more with honey than they can with vinegar. Um, we're pro-American. We're decaffeinated Americans. Sure, there's a sentiment of nationalism that underlines this country and always has. There's a sentiment of anti-Americanism that's always been part of of the country, and that strain, and it comes from our origins. I'm not kidding that we're the original anti-Americans, but the sensible center knows exactly where the interests lie. So we're up here kind of, and I am on this side of the border now, kind of shaking our head and going, how did all this happen? Anyway.
I had a question about which you've talked to a bit about energy and perhaps the push to go east-west with energy instead of to go north-south. with pipelines and so forth? Is that, do you think that's an issue?
Brendan, you want to?
Yeah. So this is another one of the classic questions of Canadian domestic politics informing international relations and vice versa.
Mm-hmm.
Indeed, the Liberal Party of Canada, the National Liberal Party, that is, the intense hostility that it engenders in much of Western Canada today um, dates back to energy policies of the 1970s, which were designed to try to use the energy resources wealth of largely in Alberta, but also in Western Canada more broadly, as a means of building the Canadian national economy with as many Westerners, particularly but not only in Alberta, feeling that was coming at their expense. And so um, the past few months, much of Canadian national politics has been dominated by questions of would there be a deal between the Canadian government, the new Carney administration, and the provincial government in Alberta, led by a provincial level Conservative Party, which is separate from the National Conservative Party, in part because I was just talking about the divisions within that provincial party, some of which are explicitly saying Alberta should go it alone and have a north-south pipeline and just do its own deal with the United States, sell its oil there, and in some respects, some of that is explicitly pro Alberta independence, and potentially as a preview of Alberta annexation. And then others who are either lukewarm or outright opposed to that position, but might want to use that pressure to negotiate a stronger position for Alberta vis-a-vis, again, an east-west pipeline. So there is indeed there was negotiated an MOU, a memorandum of understanding. The devils is going to be in the details, but for the moment, the Alberta government and the Carney administration have come into alignment. The question, as I see it, is going to be whether Carney can keep his own coalition on board, because there's a lot of opposition to it in British Columbia, where the oil is going to have to go through to the sea, and then more left-leaning regional backers of the Liberal Party, particularly in Quebec, where it, we'll see if we'll see if Carney's going to be able to keep his own team on board long term. Drew?
Yeah. So in the question's great because it's energy is the biggest export to the United States. Bilateral, the biggest export product, exports and imports. And I did mention earlier that the United States exports energy to Canada, particularly in the East Coast. Um, um, it's in both countries' interests to be trading in this product. 99% of Canadian exports now of energy go to the United States. It's the classic example where the Canadian government, and let's think of the Canadian government as figuratively being the same party, or on the surface being the same party as the Trudeau government before, but being very different. Circumstances are different. The mentality is different. The Trudeau government was left of center, environmentalist. This is a return to centrism and trying to balance environmental sentiment and Indigenous rights with development. This is a natural resources economy. Blessed with natural resources, sometimes we take it for granted, hewers of wood, drawers of water, but there's, it's not easy stuff to do. And the Carney government wants to develop it, and it wants to develop it in a particular way on a national basis, not just exporting to the United States, but as Brendan noted, exporting to Asia, potentially to Europe. And it's not just about oil and gas and liquefied natural gas. You can say the same thing about electricity. Electricity, we do import electricity from the United States, but we export more. Those export lines are almost exclusively north south. Now, that makes sense in economic terms. If you look at the analysis, it makes perfect sense that they were developed this way. And this was taking place actually before free trade, although the greatest amount of expansion has been since, particularly from Quebec, Hydro-Quebec to New England, New York, beyond. Exclusively so. So now you have a situation in which the politics and the economics actually contradict each other. And the whole point of free trade was to try to find a balance, and that was always a tender balance. So it makes perfect sense for us to be exporting gas to the United States and oil and liquefied natural gas to Asia. We can wean China to a limited degree, Korea off coal. We like to find ways that we're a superpower, right? Because we live against the United States, which actually is in just about every way. So we've come to describe ourselves as an energy superpower because I think it makes us feel better. We're a superpower in something, but we are. Brendan just put his finger on the challenge. It's a very regional economy. The West doesn't even speak with one voice. So Alberta has the oil. It's got to go through British Columbia. And by the way, you're going to send tankers out from the coast on a coastline that has a tanker ban for environmental reasons. Carney government is going to have to square that circle. I think actually they can do it because now's the time where they're going to find some way to get the British Columbia government on board. But this is all being driven. It probably would have happened anyway, but it's largely being driven by a changed relationship with the United States. So yes, more east-west, but in a context in which for a long time there was very good reason not to build east-west as much as you were building north-south. That's where the people are.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Uh, Anybody else have any other questions?
I
I
think
just, I
we
just had a
need
real
to,
quickie about.
okay, really quick, because we are way over, and but
No,
I
I
think
know.
this
Yeah.
is,
Well, this is a broad subject, but the Northland, obviously, you folks have the second largest Arctic what land mass in the world, second to Russia. Theirs is much more militarized, as you know. I'm just curious, you can just give me a yes or no answer, but is the intent to build up the North so that in theory, way down the pike, it will be better defended and able to kind of be a significant part of Canada vis-a-vis the competition, meaning Russia?
Yeah.
I know that's a broad question, and
Well, so yes, and so I've done work in the north, and so I've been up there, and I've reported from up there, although that's a long time ago now. We have the most underdeveloped north of all the term is
yeah,
circumpolar countries. Russia has a developed north, not just in terms of defense, but actually economic development. The oil and gas reserves in the Canadian Arctic are substantial, but have never really been tapped. But beyond that, there's the issue of defense. So, one, actually, the population of the North, which is about 50% indigenous, is way underdeveloped in terms of living standards. Housing is a disgrace, healthcare is a disgrace. It's a small population, but as I say, it's about 50% of the population. And the whole area is underdeveloped. Underdeveloped now in terms of defense. What's the fastest way for Russia to reach the United States? Through
yeah,
Canada. And of course, and this is to a sizable extent legitimate, if the United States, if Canada does not develop its Arctic in the New World Order in such a way with the United States that the superpower is satisfied, they'll do it for us. you'll do it for us. And that's something Canada doesn't want. So at last, we've pledged and we're moving to 2% of GDP on defense. We've been at 1.3. We're an underspender. There's no question we've been a free rider, but there's a recognition that this is a problem. And the greatest part of development will be in the north, because we know that's where we should be focusing. And the United States wants to ensure that we do it. Now, I know lots of people in the defense community who, are thinking hard about this. It's a focus. Carney is committed. We'll see how fast it's done. And by the way, the nice benefit of this is the expanded airports, the new airports, the seaports, the radar, all that stuff is going to benefit the population up there.
And I'll simply add that this speaks again as a historian. We're always asking more change, continuity over time, a lot of continuity. Some of these debates, particularly with the United States, go back a really long time.
100%.
Both in terms of military presence, indigenous rights, and literally definitions of what counts as like the laws of the sea in the context of a frozen sea. These go back pre-Trump 1.0, go back decades. And part of the reason why they haven't been resolved is that there's never been one moment where the U.S. and Canada totally align in terms of relations on these types of questions, even as they're moving towards increasing integration on other matters, such as NORAD. So both can happen. I think what this history points to is a means of previously managing these types of disagreements without turning over the cart on all other matters. But now we're seeing the turning of the cart over just really throwing roadblocks all across the way. And so that is the bigger change relative to previous times that I see.
So wait.
Great, thank you.
Wait, to clarify, then you're saying that they are or they are not beginning to cooperate on something that is a common goal really for both countries.
I think what Drew's pointing to is right now we have these state-to-state commitments. Canada is indeed boosting its defense spending substantially. Right. That is in fact a change. What I'm seeing in like the longer durée here is that previous disagreements over quite literally what is Canadian territory, what is American territory, it claims to the Arctic. Those both countries could continue to disagree on a matter so fundamental as that, and put it to the side, and agree to cooperate on questions like NORAD. Whereas right now, I think we just see the Trump administration bundling all types of problems and throwing them together, and saying unless we get ABC. All these other matters which we have agreement and alignment on are going to be put into question. And that I think is the new paradigm that Drew is talking about here. The inability to separate disagreement on one hand in one file and management and alignment on a whole host of others.
Yeah, I think that actually is true, but I'd say it's an additional point, and I think you're bang on, Brent. So fundamental point on defense, Canada has committed to doing a lot more, as other NATO partners have done, right? We too have thought of ourselves as kind of in this magnificent, empty area of the globe, right? The United States has benefited hugely from two big oceans. It allowed itself, it had the luxury of being able to be a little isolationist and withdrawn from the world for so long, and then rebuilt the world, the world order after World War II. We had the same. And we recognize that it's no longer applicable. The issue that Brendan just mentioned is fundamental to the negotiation. So let me add a fourth scenario that, that you do a deal on defense and trade. We call it a grand bargain. And there's an actual treaty that's signed. Would it go through the Senate? I don't know. that related trade and economic relations with defense in a way that we never really have because we've situated them differently. We've always been able, as Brendan said, to disagree on something and agree. We Canada didn't want to play a role in the Vietnam War. One of the it's a funny moment, but Lyndon Johnson really got mad at the Canadian Prime Minister who came down to he actually gave a speech at Temple and criticized the administration. And I won't say what happened because these are what he actually said, but that was the time in which we negotiated the first sectoral free trade agreement, the Auto Pact, which I haven't mentioned before. That was the prototype for free trade. You could agree and disagree. The depth of relations were such that you could do that. The United States wouldn't necessarily have done that with other countries. Now Trump is linking again. So, we'll see where it goes. But that's a fourth scenario. It might be a happy one, although Canadians are so anti-Trump and as a result so anti-American right now that it might not stand politically. But anyway.
Well, that strikes me as one of the most important things that the two countries could do, because that is to not be able to control the Arctic is serious for the defense, certainly of the United States, but Canada as well. So if we can't agree and do that more efficiently in coordination, we're in big trouble. But in any case, I want to thank you.
Thank you.
We actually talked about, we're not that far from New Haven, that we would have loved to have been doing, but of course, you went back up to Canada, so we couldn't have done this all in person anyway, but maybe
And
we'll
I'll
get to meet you.
please do, and I'll add, we do our Canadian Studies Committee. We've got a mailing list, and sometimes we do hybrid events. Increasingly, it's more in person, but we do try to film them. So if you're interested in joining our mailing list, check out the Yale Macmillan Center website, and the Canadian
Thank
Studies
you.
is one of those programs, and you're very very welcome to join on, and we'd love to have you.
Okay.
Write the Yale Macmillan website on
Yeah.
the chat right
So,
now.
sure. I will pull that up.
No,
Drew
Thank you.
and Brandon, thank you so much. Thank you for
Yes.
doing this. This is absolutely marvelous. I'm so glad I connected with you. And please thank Jay Gitlin for me
Yes, of course.
for having said that he found two volunteers who would come and talk to
It's
our
been a
group.
pleasure. It's been a
Yeah.
pleasure,
Terrific
and
job. Thank you so much.
no, thank
best of the
you.
season. I know where all of you are. I've been through a number of times. You got a
Well,
nice spot there.
stop sometime,
So
maybe on your way through or whatever.
yeah.
Yes,
No.
please, we'd love to see you. So just drop us a line. So,
Okay.
Okay.
we'll be ready for you. So on behalf of our colleagues, Chapel Library, may we all wish you a very happy Hanukkah, Merry Christmas, with peace, good health in the new year, peace, really. Um, and join us again on Monday, February 9, 2026. We'll begin our spring session with Peter Nussler from the U.S. Department of State speaking on Eastern Europe. And we
Cool.
certainly look forward to seeing everyone then. Any news that you two want to ever sort of come back on and say, hey, we want to talk some more, we would love to have you back. So thank you. Also, when you go back to Canada and aren't so much affiliated with Yale, please, let us know too.
Just
And,
really quick, I can see someone in the audience is asking to share
oh,
the Macmillan and Canadian Studies sites. I don't believe I'm able to. I just added it to the chat, but I think that's just the folks on the screen. So if someone's able to share that with Marie, I believe she's asking, and I'm not able to. But I've got the links in the chat for the folks who are
okay,
on
Joan,
the
maybe
screen
you
now.
can just follow up with an email.
Yeah. I'm going
Great, thank you.
to do it right now. Hold on.
Okay, thank you very much. So, Joan, do you want to say a final goodbye to everyone?
In a second, as soon as I get this up,
Okay.
paste. Okay, I just did it. Okay, everybody should have the site. And I want to thank all of you for coming to all the programs here at the library, especially the foreign policy discussion groups. I love working with this group of the planning committee. It's been an anchor for me for so many years. And I just found out all the information that you're going to need when I see you, June, about the history of the Foreign Policy Discussion
Oh,
Group,
thank you.
Oh
starting when we
boy.
were with the Foreign Policy Association. So this has been since many, 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 many years, almost 25 years, actually, when we started. So thank you all. It's been my pleasure to know all of you. And with that, I say all of you have a happy holiday and mostly peaceful and safe one.